Right now, 5 billion people use the World Wide Web. Ask any one of them who invented it, and they'll say Tim Berners-Lee. They're not entirely wrong, but they're not entirely right either. Because 57 years before Berners-Lee wrote a single line of code, a Belgian librarian in Brussels had already built it on paper, with index cards, with telegraph wires, and with a vision so complete it included clickable links, multimedia retrieval, and global search. His name was Paul Otlet. You've never heard of it, and that is not an accident. In 1940, Nazi soldiers walked into a building in Brussels called the Palais Mondial. Inside were 15 million index cards, hundreds of thousands of photographs, thousands of dossiers, and the architectural skeleton of something that had no name yet, something the 20th century would eventually call the Internet. The soldiers cleared it out, not to destroy it, to store stolen paintings. They needed the space. And with that single administrative decision, the most advanced information system ever built was pushed into crates, scattered, and forgotten. Its creator died 4 years later, broke, in an apartment stripped of nearly everything he owned. He was 76 years old. The war had taken his work. History would take his name. Paul Otlet was born in Brussels in 1868 into a family of some privilege. His father was a wealthy businessman with interests in Congo, and the household ran on confidence and ambition. Otlet inherited both. He was a restless, almost uncomfortably serious child, the kind of boy who read not for pleasure but for architecture. He wanted to understand how knowledge was held together, how one idea locked into another, whether there was a system underneath the apparent chaos of human thought. He studied law at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, earned his degree, and then almost immediately abandoned the profession. Law, he decided, was about managing disputes. He wanted something larger. He wanted to manage knowledge itself. In the 1890s, that was not a small ambition, it was a nearly incomprehensible one. Libraries existed, yes. Encyclopedias existed, but they were islands. A scientist in Brussels had no efficient way to know what a scientist in Tokyo had published last year. A doctor in Paris couldn't quickly access everything written about a given disease. Information existed in abundance and was simultaneously almost impossible to find. Otlet saw this as the central crisis of modern civilization. Not war, not poverty, though he cared about those, but the fundamental disconnection of human knowledge from human need. He partnered with a lawyer and fellow bibliophile named Henry Lafontaine, and together they began building what they called the Universal Bibliographic Repertory, a master index of everything ever published. Not a library, an index of libraries, a catalog of catalogs. They settled on a system called the Universal Decimal Classification, an expansion of Melville Dewey's decimal system, and they began filling index cards. Millions of them, by hand. In a building in Brussels that they called, with characteristic audacity, the Mundaneum, the world's knowledge, housed in one place. By 1914, they had 12 million cards. By 1934, 15 million. But the cards were never the point. The cards were the substrate. What Otlet was actually building was something else entirely. In 1934, Paul Otlet published a book called Monde, World. In it, he described a system he called the Réseau Mondial, the World Network. He described individual documents linked to other documents by what he explicitly called links. He described a global machine through which a user could, from their home, send a query through telephone or telegraph wires to a central repository, and receive back not just text but images, sound recordings, and film. He described the results being displayed on a flat screen. He described the ability to annotate documents, add personal notes, and share those notes with others across the network. He called the individual nodes in this system artificial brains, machines that stored and processed knowledge the way human brains did, but without the limitations of a single skull. Read that again slowly. Links between documents, remote search, multimedia retrieval, flat screen display, annotation and sharing, a global network, in 1934, in Brussels. This was not science fiction. Otlet wasn't writing a novel. He was drafting an engineering proposal. He had already built the physical prototype, the Mundaneum, and was describing its logical extension into a fully electronic, globally connected system. He even sketched diagrams. The diagrams look, with unsettling familiarity, like early network topology maps. The language he used, links, nodes, network, is the language of the web. And here is where the story pivots, because in 1934, nobody listened. The Belgian government had been an uneasy patron for years. They'd given Otlet space, then taken it back. They'd funded him partially, then cut funding. By the mid-30s, the Mundaneum had already been evicted from one building and relocated. Otlet was spending his own money to keep it alive, supplemented by donations that grew harder to find as the Depression tightened across Europe. He wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to governments, to foundations, to industrialists, proposing collaborations, asking for support, laying out in clear and practical language exactly what he was trying to build and why it mattered. The responses were polite. The funding didn't come. He kept working. He was in his late 60s, he had spent 40 years on this project, and the world was beginning to accelerate toward a catastrophe he could see coming. He wrote about peace, about internationalism, about the idea that a truly connected world, a world where all human knowledge was accessible to all human beings, would be, structurally, harder to drive into war. The Mundaneum wasn't just an information system to Otlet, it was a peace project. He believed it with a fervor that his contemporaries found, variously, inspiring and exhausting. In May 1940, Germany invaded Belgium. Within weeks, the country fell. The occupation administration needed the Palais Mondial for storage. Otlet's 15 million cards, his photographs, his documents, the physical embodiment of 40 years of work, they were crated and moved to a basement. The space was given over to artworks looted from Jewish families across Europe. The Nazis didn't burn the Mundaneum. They just needed the room. The indifference was, in its way, worse than destruction. His life's work was displaced to make room for stolen paintings. Otlet died on December 10, 1944, months after the liberation of Brussels, but too late to see his archive restored, too late to see any acknowledgement of what he had done. The work sat in boxes for decades. Now comes the part of the story that requires some precision, because it's easy to oversimplify, and the facts are already extraordinary enough without embellishment. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, a British scientist working at CERN in Geneva, wrote a proposal for what he called an information management system. He published the World Wide Web in 1991. He was, by any reasonable measure, a genius. His specific technical implementation, HTTP, HTML, URLs, the client-server model that made the web actually function on the Internet's existing infrastructure, was original, rigorous, and transformative. This is not a story about accusing Tim Berners-Lee of theft. He didn't steal anything. But here is what the record shows. Berners-Lee himself, in a 1998 interview and in subsequent writing, acknowledged Otlet's work when it was brought to his attention. He said he had not known about it when he designed the web. He has since described Otlet as a visionary who independently arrived at the same conceptual framework. The acknowledgement is genuine and, to his credit, unambiguous. But the acknowledgement came only after researchers, led significantly by a Belgian information scientist named W. Boyd Rayward, who spent years reconstructing Otlet's archive, had published enough documentation to make the parallel impossible to ignore. Rayward's work, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 90s, pulled Otlet's papers from obscurity and established the documentary record clearly. The 1934 diagrams, the language of links and nodes, the description of remote multimedia search, the proposal for a global network. None of this was ambiguous or required creative interpretation. It was there, in Otlet's own words, in his own hand, 57 years before the web went live. The question that Rayward's work raised, and that nobody has cleanly answered, is not whether Otlet came first. He did. The question is why it took until the 1990s for anyone to notice, and whether the institutional mythology that formed around the web's invention, Silicon Valley, American ingenuity, the Cold War Internet that became the civilian web, was served by that ignorance remaining intact. There is no conspiracy here. The erasure of Paul Otlet was accomplished by more mundane forces: a world war, a Nazi occupation, an archive in boxes, and the simple fact that history tends to credit the person who builds the thing that works at scale over the person who imagined it before the tools existed to build it. Otlet was working in the 1930s with paper and telegraph wire. Berners-Lee was working in 1989 with networked computers. The gap between them is not one of vision, it is one of infrastructure. Otlet had the vision and no infrastructure. The infrastructure arrived 50 years after he described exactly what to do with it. That gap, 1934 to 1991, is the central fact of this story. 57 years during which the conceptual framework for the World Wide Web sat in crates in a Brussels basement, described in published books, available to anyone who looked. Nobody looked. Or more precisely, the people who were looking in California and Geneva, not in Belgium, not in the archives of a dead librarian who had written in French and died before anyone alive had built a working computer. The Mundaneum still exists. It was re-established as a museum in Mons, Belgium in 1998, the same year, almost to the month, that Berners-Lee acknowledged Otlet's work. Google has provided funding to the museum. There is a plaque. There are guided tours. Schoolchildren visit. Paul Otlet's face appears on exhibition panels next to diagrams of the web, the lines of descent drawn clearly and without apology. And yet, ask anyone who invented the internet, who invented the web, and you will almost certainly not hear his name. The story that circulates, the one that gets taught, begins with ARPANET, moves through Berners-Lee, credits American research universities and British physicists, and presents the web as a product of the late 20th century, of Cold War science, of Silicon Valley ambition. That story is not false. It is incomplete. It is incomplete in a way that has consequences, not legal consequences, not technical ones, but the kind that matter to how we understand where ideas come from and who gets to own them. Because the mythology of invention is not neutral. When we decide whose name goes on a discovery, we are also deciding whose way of thinking gets remembered, whose institutions get credit, whose culture gets to claim the future it helped imagine. Paul Otlet was a Belgian librarian who believed that knowledge was a commons, that every piece of information ever produced by a human being should be accessible to every other human being, regardless of nationality or class or language. That belief was the engine of everything he built. It is also, not coincidentally, the stated founding principle of the World Wide Web, of Wikipedia, of the open internet movement that has been contested and partially won and partially lost across the last 30 years. The man who first articulated that principle, who built its first physical embodiment, who wrote it down in French in Brussels in 1934. That man died with his archive in a basement, his funding gone, his country occupied, his life's work used as a storage room for stolen art. There is something in that image that refuses to be softened. The Nazis didn't need to burn the Mundaneum. They just needed the square footage. The work of a man who spent 40 years trying to connect all of human knowledge was simply set aside, in crates, to make room for paintings that didn't belong to anyone who put them there. And then the world moved on and built the thing he had described and forgot to mention his name. Paul Otlet's archive is now preserved. His books are digitized. His diagrams are reproduced in academic papers and museum exhibits. Scholars who study the history of information science know his name well. His reputation among that small community is secure and high. But the broader story of who built the conceptual foundation of the web has not corrected itself at the level where it would matter most. In classrooms, in the popular imagination, in the casual shorthand of technological history. He imagined a world where every human being could reach every piece of knowledge ever created. He spent his life trying to build it. He died before anyone told him he had been right. And now, in a world that lives inside the thing he described, his name remains one that most people encounter only in a footnote, if at all. That is the distance between vision and credit. That is what gets lost when history moves fast and archives get boxed up, and the people who build what comes next don't look backward long enough to see whose shoulders they're standing on. His name was Paul Otlet. He built the World Wide Web in 1934. The world built it again in 1991 and forgot to tell him.